This video is all about processing instruction and input-based approach for teaching grammar. Input processing has two major principles. The first major principle is called the primacy of meaning. This is where learners process input for meaning before they process it for form. Under the first major principle is the primacy of content words principle. It is where learners process content words in the input before anything else. Next is the lexical preference principle. It is where learners prefer processing lexical items before grammatical items for the same semantic information. There is also the preference for non-redundancy principle, where learners are more likely to process non-redundant meaningful grammatical form before they process redundant meaningful forms. The meaning before non-meaning principle is where learners are more likely to process meaningful grammatical forms before non-meaningful forms irrespective of redundancy. The availability of resources principle is where learners possess a default strategy that assigns the role of agent to the first noun that they encounter in the sentence. The sentence location principle is where the learners intend to process items in the sentence initial position before those in the final position and those in the medial position. The second major principle is called the first noun principle. It deals with how word order affects the processing strategies. This principle postulates that learners have a tendency to assign the role of the agent to the noun in the first sentence or the utterance even when the first noun is not the subject. Learners always intend to process the first noun in the sentence. The lexical semantics principle is where learners rely on lexical semantics where possible instead of word order to interpret sentences. Under this principle is also the event probabilities principle, where learners rely on main event probabilities where possible instead of word order in order to interpret sentences. And the last one is the contextual constraint principle, where learners may rely less on the first noun principle if preceding context constrains the possible interpretation of a clause or a sentence. On structured input activities, Lee and Van Patten defined structured input as input that is manipulated in particular ways to push learners to become dependent on form and structure to get the meaning. Their guidelines for developing structured input activities are as follows. First is to present one thing at a time. You should not burden your students with too many information all at once. Second is to keep meaning in focus. Make sure that meaning is the focus. Keep in mind that principle 1 is the primacy of content words. Next is to move from sentences to connected discourse. Gradually, introduce lessons to the learners. Work on little improvements on daily basis. Always remember to use both oral and written input. Do not stick on one input only. Every learner learns differently from one another. When providing input, make sure that your learners are engaged in input processing. This works better than listening alone. And the last one is to keep the learner's processing strategies in mind. Each of your learner's development matters. Take into account the learner's strategy to ensure better transfer of input. Other types of structured input activities include supplying information, surveys, matching, binary options such as true or false, logical or illogical, normal or strange, and others, ordering and ranking. And the last one is selecting alternatives. There are many other types of input activities that a teacher can use depending on the classroom situation. And on the last note, processing input can be seen as a practical solution to the difficulty of having learners transform their understanding of grammatical explanation into communicative use. Nevertheless, teachers thinking of adding processing input to their repertoire of grammar teaching techniques may wish to modify it in the light of their own experiences.